Hello everyone, it's Jamie from Old Shipping Lines, and welcome back to a new video, a special one. In fact, in today's video, we will be talking about the White Star vessel, the RMS Olympic. While we all know her history quite well, today we will focus on a specific moment in her story, the night her sister ship, the RMS Titanic, sank. We will discuss the whereabouts of the Olympic on that tragic night, as well as the immediate aftermath of the disaster, and how it affected the RMS Olympic. However, I won't be doing this alone. Joining me today is a dear friend of mine, Liam Sharpe. Liam is an amazing historian and modeler who works on the team behind the YouTube channel Oceanliner Designs and the game GrandVoyage. I'll put links in the description to Liam's socials, and a huge thank you to Liam for being part of this video. The video will be divided into two parts. Liam will talk about the Olympics' whereabouts on that fateful night, and I will talk about the immediate aftermath and how it impacted the RMS Olympic. So, with that lengthy introduction out of the way, let's begin.
So, let's set the stage. It's 1912 and the new White Star liner, the RMS Titanic, began her maiden voyage on April 10th, sailing from Southampton to New York. She had been at sea for 4 days. However, at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, April 14th, 1912, disaster struck. The Titanic collided with an iceberg, and shortly after midnight on April 15th, 1912, ship's time, Captain Smith was informed by designer Thomas Andrews that the ship was doomed. The forward holds were flooding, and while the flooding in Boiler Room 5 was being managed with pumps, Boiler Room 6 was also filling with water. This meant 5 watertight compartments were flooding uncontrollably, but the ship was only designed to stay afloat with up to 4 compartments flooded. Among other actions, Captain Smith also ordered a distress call to be sent out and the lifeboats to be prepared. The RMS Olympic had barely been out of New York for more than a day when at 10:50 p.m. on Sunday, April 14th, 1912, New York time, she received a wireless message that the Titanic was signaling distress after striking an iceberg. Initially, due to atmospheric interference, it was difficult to confirm whether it was truly the Titanic that was in trouble. However, 10 minutes later, it became clear that her sister ship was indeed sending out distress signals. At 11:10 p.m. or approximately 1 a.m. local time, the Titanic reported her position as 4146 north, 5014 west, stating, "We have struck an iceberg." By this time, Captain Haddock had calculated the necessary course to reach the Titanic, altering the Olympic's course accordingly and ordering the chief engineer to bring the engines to full power. Unfortunately, the distance between the Olympic and her stricken sister ship was 505 miles. By then, the Titanic's bow was visibly settling lower into the water. At 11:20 p.m. New York time, the Titanic sent a message. "Tell the captain to prepare the lifeboats and please provide your position." The Olympic responded. "Commander Titanic at 4:24 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. We are 4052 north, 6118 west. Are you steering south to meet us?" Haddock realized the Titanic was in serious trouble when she signaled. "We are putting passengers off in small boats." Knowing it would take time to reach Titanic, Haddock had only inquired about the weather conditions, which fortunately were clear and calm. At 11:50 p.m., Haddock signaled, "Commander Titanic, I am letting up all available boilers as quickly as possible." By 1:40 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, local time on the Titanic, the forecastle was already submerged, and the bow was sagging as the ship sank rapidly. Meanwhile, it would take about 12 hours for all of the Olympic's additional boilers to become operational and reach optimal pressure, meaning it could take over a day to reach the stricken liner. As she raced towards the disaster site, the Olympic repeatedly called the Titanic between 4:15 a.m. and 5:20 a.m. on April 15th, 1912, but received no response. By 7:45 a.m. New York time, or around 9 a.m. local time, the Olympic was still 310 miles from her sister ship, having covered 195 miles in 8 hours and 35 minutes at just under 23 knots. Her slower speed was due to the additional boilers needing time to build up sufficient steam and power for her engines. However, her speed had significantly increased since she initially set course for the Titanic. Later that night, the Olympic received a message from Captain Rostron of the Cunard liner RMS Carpathia, which had arrived at the scene. Rostron informed that continuing towards the Titanic would be futile. As the message reads, "All boats are accounted for. About 675 souls have been saved. The Titanic sank at approximately 2:20 a.m. He requested that this information be forwarded to the offices of the White Star and Cunard Line and mentioned that he was returning to port in New York. Consequently, the wireless room on the Olympic served as a clearinghouse for radio messages. When Olympic offered to take on Titanic survivors from Carpathia, Rostron declined the offer on the orders of Ismay, who was worried that having the survivors aboard a ship that resembled Titanic too closely might cause them additional stress. Most of the passengers on the Olympic during the Titanic sinking were asleep, and thus did not notice the change in course. However, a few passengers who were still awake did see the ship making a noticeable sharp turn. One of these passengers described a noticeable level of anxiety on board, recalling that it was evident that something was wrong. We have two testimonials from the RMS Olympic's passengers, the first one being from Earl. His last name is unknown. He would write the following to home Monday morning. "And a great morning it is too. The sea had quieted down some and the sun is shining today. Titanic, a sister ship, is in distress off the coast of Newfoundland. We have altered our course since 3 o'clock since this morning and we are racing to her at full speed. We are making 25 knots an hour and expect to reach her at about 3 o'clock this afternoon." One passenger, novelist R.H. Benson, wrote a diary of the day stating, "On coming down from Mass this morning, I heard a sentence from a lift boy that made me wonder. I asked what was the matter, and he told me that the Titanic had communicated with us that she was in a sinking condition and that we are moving full speed towards her." The Olympic arrived in Southampton docks by 2 a.m. on April 21st, 1912, approximately a day late despite her 14-hour high-speed run. The Daily Mirror reported on April 22nd, 1912, that Captain Haddock was so exhausted from the intense effort over the past 24 hours and deeply distressed by the tragic news of the Titanic, the full details of which had only reached him the previous day in Plymouth, that he slept through the entire morning.
Shortly after the sinking of her ill-fated sister ship, the RMS Olympic's first port of call, with her flags flying at half-mast, was Plymouth Harbor at dawn on April 20th, 1912, arriving a day later than usual. It was there that the passengers first learned the full extent of the tragedy through newspaper reports. The Olympic then continued to Cherbourg, arriving at 1:30 p.m., coincidentally, an hour late, just as the Titanic had been 10 days earlier. When the Olympic finally reached Southampton in the early hours of Sunday, April 21st, 1912, Captain Haddock found the home port in a state of shock and mourning. Nevertheless, urgent work needed to be done. Upon returning to his home country, Haddock faced criticism from two reporters, Tewson and Leatherdale of the London Daily Express. They accused him of misleading initial reports with a message that claimed all Titanic's passengers safe. Haddock, along with his two wireless operators, denied ever sending such a message. According to author Wade Sisson, Haddock drafted a statement saying, "In the presence of the Marconi operators, I have denied that such a message was received or sent from Captain Haddock." A New York Times article on April 21st clarified the origin of the rumor. It stated, "Captain Haddock was able tonight to give to the New York Times the most dramatic possible explanation of the message attributed to him received on Monday in London and New York to the effect that all the Titanic's passengers had been saved and that the ship was being towed to Halifax." The article featured an explanatory headline, "Erroneous Report of Titanic's Safety Explained, How Are All Titanic Passengers Safe?" and "Towing Oil Tank to Halifax" became "All Titanic Passengers Safe, Towing to Halifax." Haddock himself told reporters, "The story that I sent the report about the Virginian towing the Titanic is flagrant invention. The Olympic steamed nearly 400 miles before discovering that she would be too late to render any aid." Wireless operator Bagot of the RMS Olympic wrote that upon their arrival in Southampton, they were summoned to his cabin. Captain Haddock thanked us. For what? We wondered. Earlier, on April 20th, 1912, Haddock had written a report to the Marconi Company, praising the operator's work. Can scarcely speak too highly of these officers' conduct at a very trying and anxious time. Mr. Moore especially worthy of promotion, thoughtful and reliable. Haddock himself arrived in Southampton utterly exhausted. According to Sisson, he was so exhausted that he slept through the remainder of the morning. Other newspapers also reported that when the Olympic returned to Southampton, Haddock appeared exhausted and stressed. Perhaps he had an inkling of what was to come. Similar to the Titanic, the Olympic also lacked sufficient lifeboats for all passengers. Consequently, the White Star Line hastily arranged for additional second-hand collapsible lifeboats, said to have been sourced from nearby naval vessels, to be installed in time for her scheduled departure just 3 days later, on April 24th, 1912. However, a mutiny was already brewing. The New York Times published an article on April 23rd, the day before sailing, with the headline, "Rush to make Olympic safe. Otherwise, it is said, passengers and crew will refuse to sail." The subsequent report, titled RMS Olympic Mutiny over Titanic's Boat Situation by Terry Randall, dated April 15th, 1931, details what transpired. Upon arriving at Southampton in the early hours of Sunday, April 21st, the Olympic found her home port in mourning. Despite the pervasive gloom, activity in the dockyard was unusually intense. At the White Star dock, preparations were underway for her imminent departure, scheduled for April 24th. In light of recent events, significant modifications to the life-saving equipment on the boat decks were imperative before setting sail. Immediate efforts began to embark 40 Berthon collapsible lifeboats to ensure adequate capacity for all passengers. This operation was closely overseen by Captain Maurice Clark, Assistant Marine Surveyor of the Board of Trade at Southampton, who had recently cleared the Titanic for sailing. White Star's Marine Superintendent, Captain Benjamin Steele, directly supervised the loading of these additional lifeboats. The number of required boats fluctuated frequently, initially loaded with 35 extra boats. A subsequent message reduced the requirement to 24, leading to rumors about the reasons for unloading the surplus. By breakfast time on Wednesday, April 24th, all necessary adjustments were completed, including securing and covering the extra boats. Temporary wire falls were installed, and extra deckhands were enlisted to ensure operational readiness. Despite the monumental efforts of the Harland and Wolff workforce in Southampton, ultimately their labor proved futile. As work progressed on the ship, Haddock also conducted an interview with the Daily Mail, published under the headline "The Olympic Messages" on April 22nd, 1912. During the interview, he expressed his astonishment that it was an iceberg that had caused the Titanic's sinking. A week before the Titanic sank, the Olympic passed over the exact spot, or a few miles north of it, in broad daylight. We didn't spot a single piece of ice of any kind, and from the bridge of the Olympic we could see, I estimate, 20 miles in either direction. Despite the extensive preparations needed, Haddock was prepared for a midday departure to New York, as soon as Captain Clark from the Board of Trade gave clearance. With 1,400 passengers on board, however, Haddock faced another challenge within minutes of setting sail, starting early. Captain Clark boarded at 7 a.m. to inspect the new arrangements meticulously, surpassing even the scrutiny he applied to the davits on the Titanic 2 weeks prior. As passengers continued to arrive, he rigorously tested the crew, overseeing the uncovering and lowering of several boats to ensure everything functioned flawlessly. The operation proceeded smoothly, with Clark estimating an average time of just 12.5 minutes to lower each boat. At 11:50 a.m., just as Captain Clark was about to give Captain Haddock clearance to sail, a message urgently reached the bridge. The stokehold crew was abandoning the ship. A meeting quickly convened between the firemen and company managers. But despite Captain Clark's assurances of the new boat's safety, the men remained unconvinced. They insisted on the company replacing the collapsible boats with conventional lifeboats before they would agree to return on board. On April 24, 1912, the day the strike began, P.E. Curry, White Star's Southampton manager, cautioned the crew of the Olympic that disobeying orders constituted rank mutiny. He emphasized that Captain Haddock had the authority to enlist police assistance to return any deserting firemen back to the ship. Curry assured the crew that all collapsible boats would be replaced with wooden lifeboats. According to a report from the New York Times, despite these assurances, the men remained dissatisfied, and the entire staff of firemen, greasers, and trimmers, with only 3 exceptions, halted work, gathered their belongings, and departed the ship, singing, "We're all going the same way home." Unable to reach a resolution, the voyage had to be delayed. The ship's departure for New York had to be postponed until a new stokehold crew could be assembled. The Olympic was subsequently relocated to a secure anchorage off Spithead to free up the berth, while second engineer Charles McKean stayed ashore to organize the replacement crew. White Star faced the challenge of replacing the striking crew before the Olympic could resume her voyage. However, this proved to be a daunting task. By dawn the following morning, little had changed. The Olympic remained anchored in the Solent with steam ready to sail. Captain Clark, who had stayed on board to grant immediate clearance to sail once the new crew arrived, gathered several seamen on the boat deck to conduct another boat drill. This time, the results were less than satisfactory, as it took nearly 2 hours to prepare and lower just a few boats. When passengers started to appear on deck around 8 a.m., the exercise was halted to prevent causing alarm. Later that morning, the Union delegation arrived to negotiate a resolution to the dispute. After discussions, 6 of the collapsible boats were lowered into the water and left for 2 hours. Upon inspection, 5 were found to be completely dry inside, while the 6th had a small amount of water due to a tiny hole that caused minimal seepage, easily manageable by bailing in less than 3 minutes. Following a brief meeting in the captain's cabin, the Union delegates agreed to inform their members that the boats were safe on the condition that the faulty boat be replaced. As the afternoon progressed and passengers grew increasingly impatient on deck, management and engineers ashore continued to recruit replacements. It wasn't until 10 p.m. that night when the tender finally arrived alongside with a total of 168 replacement stokehold crew. This number included extra personnel deemed sufficient to enable the Olympic to operate at a faster speed than usual, aiming to recover some of the 36 hours lost. White Star had actively sought substitute firemen and trimmers, recruiting 100 men in Portsmouth and bringing in 150 more from Liverpool and Sheffield via a special train. At midnight, as the Olympic prepared once again to set sail, another message reached Captain Haddock on the bridge. More of his crew were deserting. This time, an additional 53 men comprising 35 able-bodied seamen, 5 quartermasters, 5 lookouts, 2 lamp trimmers, 4 greasers, and 2 other engine room personnel were seen boarding the tender that had brought the new crew members, all adamantly refusing to sail with the ship. The problem now wasn't merely distrust in the boats, but rather in the new crew themselves. The seamen viewed the replacements either as the dregs of Portsmouth or inexperienced firemen unfamiliar with the operations of a large vessel. Many of them didn't even possess signing on books. Twice, they defied Haddock's orders to resume their duties, despite expressing sympathy towards him. A spokesman for the seamen who deserted, named Lewis, acknowledged that the actions of the firemen in Southampton had been a disgraceful betrayal, but argued that their replacements were unfit for duty and that sailing with them would pose a safety risk. The situation must have been deeply frustrating for both Haddock and the passengers. In fact, 72 passengers volunteered to work in the stokehold, a gesture for which Haddock expressed gratitude. One first-class passenger, Ralph Sweet, who volunteered to serve as a stoker, recounted,
"Our plan was to stoke the ship to Queenstown, where the captain could arrange for fresh crew members. About 100 passengers volunteered in total, and we were prepared to work in shifts. Captain Haddock thanked us warmly, and initially it seemed he might assign us tasks immediately. However, he later informed us that he would not need to call upon our services."
The concept of using volunteers originated from the Duke of Sutherland, who was also a passenger on board the Olympic. He convened a meeting in the ship's first-class smoking room to propose a solution. In addition to organizing shifts for volunteers, the Duke offered to gather a crew of yachtsmen. Some interpreted this as a critique of Captain Haddock's leadership, but the Duke ultimately commended Haddock's handling of the situation.
"I believe all the passengers will regret not sailing under Captain Haddock's command. Regarding the criticism that he didn't provide enough information to the passengers, I'm not sure what more he could have disclosed. He certainly shared everything he knew. He managed to assemble the firemen, and I'm confident that given more time, he would have been able to gather the entire crew."
The second wave of mutiny was the final straw for Haddock, prompting him to take decisive action. Interestingly, the Olympic was anchored just off Spithead, where the historic Royal Navy mutiny of 1797, known as the Spithead and Nore mutinies, had taken place. It seemed fitting that Haddock sought assistance from the Royal Navy. According to the New York Times on April 27, 1912, the seamen began to transfer from the Olympic to the tug that had brought the replacement crew. Captain Haddock ordered them to return, but his commands were ignored. He then signaled the cruiser Cochrane, whose captain boarded the Olympic, and warned the men of their mutinous conduct, highlighting the serious consequences they faced. The men still refused to comply. Further details from the Times, dated April 27, 1912, described Haddock standing at the doorway of the Olympic, earnestly urging the mutineers to reconsider and return to the ship. when his appeals were ignored. Distress signals were sent via wireless and Morse code flashes to the Cochrane, the nearest warship, informing them of the crew desertion and requesting assistance. Shortly after midnight, Haddock signaled the commander of the Royal Naval Cruiser HMS Cochrane, stationed half a mile away off Spithead. "Crew deserting ship. Request your assistance. Haddock, Master." Within 30 minutes, Captain W.E. Goodenough had boarded the Olympic to intervene in the dispute and attempt to persuade the men to return to their duties. While some of the men remained discontented with the boats, the main concern for the majority was the lack of experience among the new crew members. Many were not even union members. Captain Goodenough identified this as the primary issue behind the unfolding situation, noting that the men appeared more fearful of their union than the potential consequences of their actions. Efforts to deter the crew with the threat of mutiny charges proved ineffective, as no violence or threats had occurred. In fact, the men had shown respect towards the officers involved. Despite last-minute efforts to recruit more crew members, Captain Haddock found himself in a classic catch-22 situation, with the only viable option now seeming to be the cancellation of the voyage. Faced with a new stalemate on board, the White Star management in Southampton reluctantly began assembling a new deck crew in the early hours of the morning. By 11 a.m., the tender returned with over 30 new men, though Captain Clark only approved a few as fit for duty. An hour later, Clark received instructions from his office to clear the Olympic for departure once he was satisfied with the crew's readiness. However, with the ship already 2 days behind schedule, the likelihood of setting sail seemed increasingly remote. By 3 p.m., the decision to cancel the voyage was confirmed by the White Star Liverpool offices. The Olympic returned to Southampton to disembark her passengers and would remain there until her next scheduled voyage with Union-approved boats and crew on May 15th. The White Star Line, faced with refunding all passengers' money due to the cancelled voyage, was deeply displeased by this additional setback for the company. In a telegraph to the Postmaster General explaining the mail delay, he expressed,
"We earnestly hope you will ensure the appropriate punishment for the crew's mutinous behavior. Unless firm action is taken now, we fear we will struggle to restore discipline and maintain sailings."
The Olympic remained docked until the 15th of the following month, during which time Lord Mersey visited the ship while she was stationed in Southampton in preparation for the upcoming British Board of Trade inquiry into the disaster. One critical issue in the court case brought by White Star against the mutinous men was the quality of the replacements. George Martel, an ex-naval officer and quartermaster, testified for the defense, expressing his disdain. "I was thoroughly disgusted by the appearance of the men brought in to replace the striking firemen. They were the scallywags of Portsmouth." However, despite such testimonies, White Star successfully proved the charges of mutiny. With the mutiny resolved, the entire incident, following closely on the heels of the RMS Titanic sinking, added insult to injury for the White Star Line. If the company were to regain any of its lost credibility, decisive action was necessary. This action took the form of a court case against the 53 seamen who had deserted the ship shortly after departing from Southampton. The trial, commenced on Tuesday, April 30th, at the Portsmouth Police Court, where the accused men faced charges of willful disobedience to the lawful commands of Captain Haddock, master of the steamship Olympic, contrary to Section 225 of the Merchant Shipping Act, 1894. The defense lawyers centered their arguments around Article 458 of the same Act, contending that under ownership obligations, the White Star Line was responsible for ensuring the seaworthiness of their vessels. They argued that by allowing the Olympic to sail with an inexperienced crew, the scallywags of Portsmouth, the company had nearly rendered the ship unseaworthy, akin to having a breach in her hull. Norman Raybarn, representing the White Star Line, summoned Captain Benjamin Steele, the White Star Marine Superintendent in Southampton, to testify. Steele affirmed that the life-saving equipment aboard was sufficient. Additionally, Captain Clark was subpoenaed by the company to testify that all boats were seaworthy and adequately manned by skilled seamen. Regarding the competency of the replacements, Second Engineer Charles McKean, who had organized the new Stokehold crew, acknowledged that many of the newcomers lacked experience. Most were Yorkshire miners. However, he argued in court that the role of a fireman did not require skilled labor, although he humorously conceded that it was strenuous work. The verdict, announced on May 5th, favored the White Star Line. However, in his concluding remarks, the judge decided against imposing fines or imprisonment on the mutineers. He reasoned that they were likely unsettled by the recent Titanic sinking. This outcome was seen as the best possible result for the White Star Line under the circumstances. With attention now focused on Lord Mersey's inquiry in London into the Titanic's loss, the incident faded into the background. The company's legal team faced the daunting task of repairing their employer's reputation in a more public forum. On May 15th, the mutinous men returned to the Olympic and were greeted by the sight of new Harland and Wolff wooden lifeboats installed on the boat deck. One individual who may have benefited from the mutiny was Captain Clark. As Board of Trade Surveyor, he was not compensated for overtime, but his 60 hours stranded on the Olympic had gone beyond the usual call of duty. He received a bonus payment of £6.80 to acknowledge his extra efforts, which helped offset the 3-day backlog that had accumulated on his desk during his absence. The additional expense was charged to White Star in the form of an excess fee of £16. Although the episode had concluded, it lingered in memory. On May 14th, George Tyrrell MP raised a question in Parliament to Prime Minister H.H. Asquith, inquiring about potential actions against officials of the British Seafarers Union, who had hindered the departure of the Olympic, resulting in delays to His Majesty's mails. Tyrrell's query was referred to the Board of Trade, which ultimately decided, given the outcome of the Portsmouth court case, that no further prosecution was warranted. Meanwhile, the Olympic remained docked at Southampton until noon on May 15th, when she departed without incident, embarking on her 6th voyage to New York and back. However, Captain Haddock's trials were far from over. Departing Southampton on May 15th, 1912, precisely a month after the Titanic disaster, the Olympic carried slightly over 400 passengers, 1,000 fewer than during the mutiny the lowest count of her career. Arriving in New York on May 22nd, she was scheduled to depart back to Southampton on May 25th. Before departure, Senator William Alden Smith, presiding over the Senate inquiry into the Titanic disaster, boarded the ship and interrogated Captain Haddock and wireless operator E.J. Moore. According to the Senate records, Haddock identified himself as a master mariner and recounted that he first learned of the Titanic's collision from Mr. Moore, the wireless operator, approximately 500 miles west by south of the Titanic at New York time. 10:50 p.m. Sunday. Senator Smith delved into the details of the wireless messages, particularly scrutinizing whether the Olympic had suppressed information or contributed to the initial rumors surrounding the disaster. Moore provided Smith with a copy of the ship's wireless log. Haddock guided the senator and his entourage on a tour of the ship, including a demonstration where a lifeboat was fully loaded and lowered. During the tour, Haddock introduced Senator Smith to Frederick Barrett, a fireman from the Titanic. Haddock informed Senator Smith that Frederick Barrett, the leading fireman from the Titanic, was present aboard the Olympic. He then escorted Smith to the boiler room, where Barrett recounted to the senator and his group the events that unfolded aboard the Titanic following the collision with the iceberg. Pleased with the information provided by Haddock and Moore, the witnesses were subsequently dismissed, and Haddock was granted permission to continue commanding the Olympic on her return voyage to Southampton.
And that marks the end of a video, my friends. Thank you all so very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Now, if you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing to the channel, as that would help out the channel a lot. Now, if you have any thoughts, comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section down below, as I absolutely love reading your comments. And please let me know in the comment section down below as well what ships you would like me to cover in the future. Now be as well sure to check out our social media pages. We are on Twitter, we are on Instagram, and we also recently have a website, oldshippinglines.com, where we have articles of the ships we cover and we have book reviews as well. I think you will enjoy the website very much. Now, with that out of the way, guys, I wish you all a good night or day, wherever you are. Stay safe, stay happy, and we will see each other on the next video. Goodbye, my friends.